I'm here with Tom Switzer, editor of The Spectator Australia and a research fellow at the United States Study Centre at the University of Sydney. Just finished his presentation here at the AIIA Queensland. Tom, welcome back.
G'day, how are you?
I'm awake. The overwhelming majority of opinion among commentators, journalists and politicians in the West has been that the recent actions in Crimea have been unprecedented aggression by the new Russian Federation. You say differently, how so?
Well, you're right. I think there has been a conventional wisdom that has criticised Putin. They've seen his motives as illegitimate. But I would think it's wise to look at the security situation from Russia's vantage point. Since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Empire, Moscow has seen the Western security alliance move further east to Central, Eastern Europe and then into the Baltics. And there have even been attempts to integrate Ukraine and Georgia as part of NATO and ballistic missiles on the Eastern European border. So I think from Russia's perspective, they feel that this is an infringement on their sphere of influence, and this became quite evident in mid-February of this year when there was clear evidence that the European Union and the Obama administration were doing everything they could to bring down the Yanukovych government in Kiev.
Absolutely. And what would you say to the argument that this is just moral relativism, that the West should oppose, I guess, Russian expansionism on principle?
Well, I mean, certainly if Russia was going to upset the balance of power in Europe, there would be a strong case for NATO to then contain that threat, just as it did during the 50-odd years, the 40-odd years of the Cold War. But I think the circumstances in the post-Cold War, as people like James Schlesinger and George Kennan argued in the 1990s, increasingly more ambiguous and complex. And I think in this case, this is just a great power, albeit a declining great power, just saying to the Americans and to the Western Europeans, get out of our face, get out of our space. We, as a great power, are also entitled to a sphere of influence, just like the Americans have had a sphere of influence in Latin America and Central America for generations.
Absolutely. It seems that whenever these sort of conflicts pop up, that people revert to Neville Chamberlain, Hitler, the Munich Agreement, Churchill analogy. Do you think this muddies the debate?
I do indeed. I think that there's a real danger in always throwing the Munich analogy whenever there's an example of expansionism. I think certainly if Putin was intent on threatening the security of Eastern Europe, or intervening in Hungary or Poland or the Czech Republic, then there would be an absolute case for another Munich and another Hitler on our doorsteps. But look, this is Putin, I think, largely, all things considered, being defensive here. And I have seen his recent attempts to discourage the Russian separatists from going through with their referendum. They still went through it, of course, but he tried to also soften his opposition to the Ukrainian elections, which will go ahead in a couple of weeks' time. And he's tried to send signals that he's prepared to withdraw the 40-odd thousand Russian troops from the eastern border.
What do you make of the argument put forward recently by Peter Hitchens that the 6 million or so Australian dollars put forward by the EU and also the vast sums of money spent by the United States on pro-Western anti-Kremlin groups is, I suppose, used as a form of a reverse clausewitz, a sort of post-modern territorial aggression? Do you see what's happening right now?
I've dealt with Hitchens. I think he sometimes is incapable of understatement, but he's more or less right when he says that Brussels and Washington were putting a lot of pressure on the democratically elected, let's not forget it was a democratically elected, albeit very corrupt, pro-Russian government of Yanukovych. So I think there's an argument to be made that the Western interference in Ukrainian's democratic process, we had Victoria Nuland, the prominent US diplomat in the region, overheard saying that the European Unions were not being tough enough against the democratically elected government in Kiev. And she even went so far as to hand out pastries on the day, encouraging the protesters to overthrow the regime. And so from Moscow's perspective, this was a real infringement on its security interests in the region.
Absolutely. In a piece you wrote for the American Conservative magazine, you noted that the sort of American thirst for interventionism is an important blow.
Yeah.
I think one defining principle of President Obama's reign so far has been a push more towards sanctions and move away from hard power. How effective do you see a Washington-led sanctions push against the Kremlin?
Well, the problem that Washington has is that they're going to get very limited support from the Western European countries. many countries on the continent, such as West Germany, are very reluctant to indulge in sectoral interests and isolation of the Russian economy because, of course, a lot of Russian oil and natural gas goes to many Western European countries, and so they would hurt their own sense of strategic interests. And Russia, although it has been dealt a weak hand, has played their cards reasonably skillfully in the sense that they can manipulate the price of natural gas that would hurt not just Ukraine, but many Western European countries. Now, to the extent that Western European countries are reluctant to support the American economic war against Putin, and it should be stressed at this stage, Obama's wars are fairly limited, his sanctions are very limited, then it's unlikely that there'll be a full-scale economic war against Russia.
Absolutely. Tom, thank you very much.
Thanks, mate. All the best. Thank you.